In the summer of 1840, the Caro plantation lay stretched across the red Georgia soil like a kingdom built of cotton, wealth, and secrecy. From the main house, a wide veranda looked over fields of tall stalks, their white tufts glimmering under the late afternoon sun. The house itself was a testament to Madeline Caro's life, grand, immaculately maintained, with tall windows and polished floors that reflected both sunlight and her meticulous control over everything within her domain. To any visitor, she appeared the very embodiment of Southern gentility, poised, intelligent, and unassailably proper. But those who worked the land, those whose labor filled her coffers, knew the truth that no guest could ever glimpse. Madeline Caro ruled with a mixture of fascination and cruelty, a woman who measured men like cattle, who wielded fear as deftly as she did authority. Among the enslaved people on the plantation, her name carried a whispering power. Mistress Caro, they said, but in private they murmured warnings to one another, wary of speaking aloud. She had eyes that could slice through pretense, a mind that catalogued every movement, every mannerism, and every flaw. And most dangerous of all, she had her secrets. Secrets that could destroy anyone foolish enough to stumble upon them. Lydia, a young woman of 19 who had grown up on Caro plantation, observed these dynamics with a mixture of awe and fear. Her mother had served Madeline as a house slave before her, and Lydia had inherited both the responsibilities and the insight that came from decades of watching the mistress's pattern. She noticed when men disappeared from the fields or the workshops. She noted when Madeline's favored male slaves lingered too long in the main house, or returned from her private study with a pale, haunted look. These men never spoke of what had happened, but Lydia understood there was a ritual, a test, or a punishment she dared not name, and it involved her mistress in ways that made her stomach turn. Madeline Caro was a woman of contradiction. To her neighbors she was charitable, sometimes even gentle, hosting lavish teas for the wives of other plantation owners, attending church services with quiet piety, and occasionally donating to widows and orphans in the county. Yet beneath that facade lay a meticulous, calculating mind that reduced every human being around her to a problem to solve or a tool to use. Wealth, lineage, and the supposed superiority of her social class were her weapons, but her true power lay in fear and secrecy. Her obsession, however, was not merely wealth or social standing. Madeline was fascinated by the human body, by lineage, and by the delicate threads that connected people to one another. She kept journals filled with sketches, measurements, and notes about every male slave she deemed significant. Their height, eye color, bone structure, and even subtle facial markings were catalogued with precision. Some of her entries read like inventories, others like coded messages. Lydia had glimpsed these journals once, a glimpse that left her trembling for days. It was clear that Madeline did not see these men as human beings in the usual sense. They were specimens, evidence, and tools for her private schemes. The ritual Lydia feared most began when Madeline inspected a man she had selected for sale. This was never a casual occurrence. The chosen man would be summoned to the house under the pretense of work, evaluation, or training. Once inside, he would encounter Madeline in a room carefully arranged to disarm suspicion. Polished furniture, sunlight falling in symmetrical patterns, a decanter of water or brandy on the table. She would greet him with the poise of a hostess, but the eyes, the sharp, appraising eyes, betrayed her true intent. It was said that Madeline slept with every male slave she intended to sell. She framed this as an act of inspection, of testing character and resilience. But to those who knew her better, it was something darker, a violation, an assertion of ultimate control over lives that were already denied freedom. The men who survived the encounter returned to their quarters pale, silent, and haunted. The others, those who resisted or failed to meet her expectations, vanished from the plantation altogether. No one knew precisely where they went. Rumors whispered that some were sold farther south, others never mentioned again, but Lydia understood the pattern well enough to fear what might happen next. On a humid afternoon in late June, Madeline summoned one such man, a tall, broad-shouldered youth named Elias, to the main house. Lydia watched from a distance as Elias approached, trying to mask the apprehension in his gait. He was new to Caro, only recently purchased from a smaller plantation in South Carolina. He had been strong, defiant, and full of the hope that his youth might protect him from the harshness of his new mistress. That hope, Lydia knew, would not last long. Madeline greeted Elias in the parlor with a smile that seemed warm, but her eyes were clinical, scanning his body as if measuring not only his strength but the angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the shape of his hands. "Elias," she said softly, "come close." I want to speak with you." His legs stiffened. Every fiber of his being recognized the danger in those words. He obeyed, stepping forward, careful not to meet her gaze too direct. For the next hour, Lydia watched the scene unfold in fragments. Elias being instructed to perform tasks, Madeline observing with detached interest, subtle touches and corrections, the way she would brush his arm or adjust his step. There was a ritual in the movement, a cadence that Lydia knew from previous encounters: measurement, inspection, assessment, and finally, the test she dreaded even to name. By the end, Elias emerged pale, shaking slightly and silent. Madeline nodded to him, dismissing him with the same air of civility she used to greet visiting planters. "Return to your duties," she said, "and remember what we discussed." Elias bowed, muttered a wordless acknowledgement and left. No one else saw the faint tears in his eyes or the way he tried to hide the trembling in his hands. As the day wore on, Lydia reflected on the pattern she had seen for years. Madeline's actions were precise, calculated and methodical. Every male slave she intended to sell was subjected to the same routine. She measured them, recorded their traits and asserted ownership, not just over their labor but over their bodies, their very being. Lydia had often wondered why Madeline went to such length. What was the purpose behind the careful journals, the measurements, the cataloging of features? Why this obsession with recording so much detail about lives that were already owned? The answer, Lydia began to suspect, lay not in greed or vanity alone, but in something more sinister, a desire for absolute control, and perhaps a belief that her acts would create a kind of legacy. Madeline was building something, Lydia realized, though she did not yet know what: a collection of evidence, a pattern, a record that might one day be used to justify her obsession with order and punishment. Every man she sold, every body catalogued, every line in her journal was a brick in that private empire of secrecy. Night fell over the plantation and the fields emptied of laborers. Lanterns glowed faintly in the windows of the main house, and the wind carried the distant calls of owls and the rustle of trees. Lydia moved quietly through the shadows, careful not to attract attention. In her quarters, she sat by the window, writing in a small hidden notebook, a record of her own, a silent witness to what Madeline was doing. She wrote of the men, the rituals, the fear she saw in their eyes. She wrote because she feared forgetting, because she feared what might happen if no one remembered. That night, as Lydia drifted into a restless sleep, she imagined a world beyond Caro Plantation. She imagined men walking free, unmeasured, unowned. She imagined a life where their worth was not catalogued in journals or judged by the whims of a mistress. But for now that world remained a dream, distant and unattainable. The Caro Plantation was a place where power and secrecy intertwined, where fear ruled more thoroughly than law or morality, and where Lydia, the quiet observer, bore witness to the horrors that flourished in plain sight. Madeline Caro slept in her bed with calm satisfaction, her journals closed beside her, the list of men she had catalogued for sale safe and complete. To the outside world, she was a widow managing her plantation with grace. To Lydia and the men of the estate, she was a force to be feared, a reminder that wealth and power in the South carried consequences far beyond the fields and beyond the law. And somewhere in the darkness, the pattern continued, unbroken, waiting for the next day, the next inspection, the next victim in the ever-turning machinery of Caro Plantation. The seed of dread had been planted. Lydia knew that sooner or later, the outside world might arrive in the form of an inspector, a buyer, or an inquisitive stranger, and when it did, Madeline's secrets, her cruelty, her manipulations and the horrors she had catalogued, would face scrutiny. But for now, in 1840 Georgia, the mistress of Caro reigned unchallenged, her empire of terror hidden behind the mask of gentility and propriety, and the enslaved men continued to serve, to fear, and to endure in silence. By the spring of 1841, the Caro Plantation had gained a quiet reputation beyond its county lines. Traders and planters passing through whispered of Madeline's uncanny ability to maintain a workforce that was unusually disciplined and remarkably healthy. Men returned from her fields, with strong physiques, sharp minds, and strangely, no illnesses that often plagued southern plantations. Whispers of her unusual methods reached some ears in Savannah and Charleston, but rumors were carefully muted by her influence. The southern elite preferred propriety over probing inconvenient truths. It was during this season that a man arrived at Caro with letters of introduction from a northern trading house. Jonathan Reeves, a young broker from Philadelphia, had heard tales of Madeline's plantation through business contacts. His arrival was courteous, professional, yet tinged with curiosity. He was meticulous and skeptical, traits that would make him both dangerous and necessary to Madeline's plan. Madeline greeted him in the parlor, a mask of southern charm, firmly in place. Her hands, slender and pale, rested lightly on the edge of the polished mahogany table. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice warm but measured, "I understand you've come to observe our operation. Please, let me show you the estate." Reeves followed her through the fields, making mental notes as he inspected the workforce. On the surface, everything appeared pristine. The men moved efficiently, the cotton was well tended, the workers obeyed without question. Yet Jonathan, trained to notice irregularities, noted what was unusual: the absence of complaints, the precision of the labor, and the subtle, almost imperceptible fear in the eyes of the men. A few glanced at Madeline with a mixture of apprehension and reverence. During the afternoon, Madeline led Reeves to the main house. Here, the routines were more carefully curated. She asked about accounts, profits and sales, casually referred. By late spring of 1841, the tension at Plantation had become nearly palpable. Madeline's careful routines persisted, yet each day brought a new strain, a reminder that her empire of fear could be breached. Jonathan Reeves remained a quiet but persistent presence, observing, taking notes, and asking subtle questions that Madeline skillfully deflected. Lydia watched as the male slaves were inspected, one by one for sale or evaluation. The rituals had grown colder, more precise. Madeline had refined her methods, ensuring that every measure, every sketch, every note in her ledger captured the details she deemed essential. Eye color, height, scars, even the faintest traces of family resemblance. These were not merely records, they were instruments of control, instruments of evidence. The disappearance of Thomas had rattled the slaves, but Madeline had used it to tighten her grip. Fear, she understood, was the most effective tool in maintaining obedience. Each man who returned from her inspections knew the consequences of resistance, and each man who did not return was recorded carefully in her ledger, a silent testament to her control. Jonathan Reeves, however, began noticing irregularities. Some men recorded as sold were not appearing in buyers' correspondence. Others, he realized, seemed unusually conditioned, their eyes wary in ways that suggested more than ordinary discipline. He spoke carefully with Lydia during the rare moments when they were alone. "I see something here that doesn't add up," he said quietly, leaning close. "Something about the records, the sales, and the men themselves." Lydia nodded, her hands trembling. "You're right, but please, you must be careful. Madeline will stop at nothing to protect her sister. She has ways to ensure no one notices, no one questions. If she suspects you," her voice faltered, "you wouldn't leave here alive." Reeves' brow furrowed. "I need evidence. But what you tell me, it's not enough." Lydia's heart sank. "It's all coded in her ledger, but she keeps them close, and the men she sells, some never reach the buyers. You won't find them anywhere. They're gone." Reeves' eyes widened, though he did not speak. Lydia's words carried a weight he had not anticipated. He had suspected cruelty and mistreatment, but the idea that men had vanished entirely, unrecorded except in a secret ledger, was horrifying. That night, Madeline convened her inner circle, the trusted overseers and a few carefully chosen workers who had proven reliable. She outlined the next phase of her operation, her voice cold, measured and devoid of mercy. "The northern visitor observes too closely," she said. "We cannot allow the pattern to be detected. Prepare the next candidates. Every detail must be perfect. If Miss Reeves notices, we adjust accordingly." Lydia, hidden nearby, listened as Madeline's words sank into her bones. Fear and horror churned within her. The system she had witnessed for years, already cruel, was now evolving, refining itself to meet a threat, and she knew that any misstep could lead to further disappearances, perhaps even her own. Over the following weeks, Reeves increased his observations, subtly pressing Madeline during dinners and inspections. He asked about the sales, about the men's health, about records of delivery. Each time Madeline responded with a mixture of charm, authority and diversion, careful never to give away the ledger's existence. Yet the tension between them grew, a silent duel of observation and evasion. Meanwhile, Madeline escalated her rituals. Men were evaluated more frequently, often subjected to measures of physical fitness, strength and family resemblance that went far beyond ordinary bookkeeping. Lydia began to keep her own secret record of what she witnessed, scribbling in hidden corners late at night, desperate to preserve some trace of truth should the worst occur. One evening, Reeves accompanied Madeline on a tour of the storage barn. They passed rows of neatly stacked supplies, the neatly organized livestock pens, and finally reached the large barn at the edge of the property. "I'm curious," Reeves said casually, "about the workers who are no longer present. Are there records of their destination?" Madeline smiled, as always, her eyes cold and unreadable. Some were sold to distant plantations, others retired early due to illness or injury. "Life on a plantation is harsh, Mr. Reeves. Not all endure." But Lydia noticed something, a slight hesitation in Madeline's tone, a momentary flash in her eyes that betrayed more than she intended. Reeves did too, though he could not pinpoint it at the time. That fleeting hesitation planted a seed of doubt, a suspicion that would grow in the days to come. The following week, Thomas disappeared again. This time, he had learned too much, asked questions he shouldn't have. He vanished before anyone could stop him, leaving behind only the terror of those who had witnessed it. Madeline recorded his absence meticulously, noting every detail that would ensure her ledger remained a complete archive of obedience and of control. Lydia was close to breaking under the pressure. Every night, she relived what she had seen, the disappearances, the measures, the ledger entries. She wondered how many men had been claimed by the system she had once tolerated, how many more would vanish if she did nothing. Yet fear kept her silent, for to speak would almost certainly invite death. Reeves meanwhile began connecting dots, prices recorded in the ledger, the supposed buyers, the men's absences. He saw a pattern emerging, though incomplete. He questioned Madeline about discrepancies, and she deftly answered, attributing them to distant transactions, shipping errors or clerical mistakes. But he was persistent. Something in her perfectly orchestrated answers did not satisfy him. Finally, one evening, Lydia took a risk. She slipped a folded note into Reeves' coat pocket as he prepared to leave for the night. "Look closer. The ledger exists. The men are not sold. They are gone. Please, do not trust appearances. Be careful." Reeves, discovering the note, felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that Lydia, though young and seemingly powerless, had risked everything to inform him. He folded the note carefully, understanding that Madeline's operation was far more sinister than he had suspected. Madeline, in her room that night, reviewed her ledger once again. She added the newest entries with precision, her hand steady, her expression unreadable. The arrival of Jonathan Reeves had forced her to escalate, but she was confident in her control. Her empire, built on secrecy, fear, and methodical record-keeping, remained intact. Yet somewhere deep within, a faint trace of doubt lingered, a whisper that even the most meticulous plans could be undone. The stage was set. The northern visitor, armed with curiosity and intellect, had begun to pierce the carefully constructed veil of the Caro plantation. Lydia had chosen her side by risking disclosure, and Madeline, despite her brilliance and cold precision, faced an uncertain path. The coming weeks would test them all. The slaves who lived in terror, the young woman struggling with conscience, the outsider whose questions threatened exposure, and the master of Caro Plantation, whose obsession with control and documentation was about to collide with forces she could neither fully predict nor dominate. By midsummer of 1841, Caro Plantation was a place of quiet dread. The slaves moved with a cautious, haunted precision, always alert to the next inspection or disappearance. The atmosphere was thick with fear, and even the older slaves, who had endured Madeline's methods for years, began to whisper quietly among themselves, their voices low and urgent. Jonathan Reeves had grown bolder in his inquiries. He now spent entire afternoons walking the property, observing routines, inspecting the barns, and questioning overseers under the guise of curiosity about plantation management. Each interaction gave him more pieces of the puzzle, though he still lacked the key, the ledger that contained proof of Madeline's crimes. Lydia's courage had grown as well. The folded note she had given Reeves marked the beginning of her own quiet rebellion. She began subtly guiding him, hinting at patterns he might have otherwise missed, pointing out inconsistencies without ever openly revealing the depth of Madeline's operations. Every night she prayed that her efforts would not be discovered. Madeline, sensing the growing scrutiny, intensified her measures. Her routine inspections became stricter, her punishments for minor infractions more immediate and terrifying. She reminded herself daily that control was survival. The ledger was her lifeline, her insurance against suspicion. Without it, the fragile structure of her authority could collapse. It was during one of these late-night inspections that tragedy struck. Henry, her trusted overseer and accomplice, had become increasingly uneasy. Witnessing the cold precision with which Madeline selected men for her ledger, he began to question the morality of their work. For the first time in years, his certainty faltered. On the night of July 12th, a young man named Samuel, chosen for evaluation, He had hidden a small knife, perhaps in desperation, perhaps out of fear, and lunged at Henry when he was cornered in the barn. Chaos erupted. Lydia, who had been nearby, watched as Henry wrestled with Samuel. The struggle was brief, but violent. Henry subdued him, but not without injury. Blood spattered across the wooden floor, and the barn echoed with screams. Madeline arrived moments later, her calm demeanor intact, though her eyes betrayed a flash of irritation. "You see," she said softly, almost to herself, "order must be maintained. Fear is the foundation. Without it, there is chaos." Reeves, who had followed a tip about unusual nighttime activity, arrived at the plantation that night. He witnessed the aftermath. Samuel, bruised and terrified, and Henry, shaken, pale, his hands trembling. Madeline met Reeves at the doorway, her posture perfect, her voice controlled. "Jonathan," she said smoothly, "I trust you've enjoyed your tour. I assure you everything is in order." But Reeves noticed the tension in her staff, the uneven breathing of the young men, and the faint but unmistakable scent of blood. Questions that had been forming for months pressed against the walls of his restraint. He pressed forward, asking, "Where is Samuel?" "He's resting," Madeline replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A minor injury. Nothing to concern you." Reeves did not believe her. Something in her calm, in the perfection of her control, suggested the truth was far darker. That night he began planning a way to access her private records. Meanwhile, Henry withdrew from his role as Madeline's enforcer. He became cautious, subtle, and distant, no longer the loyal participant he had once been. Lydia noticed the change immediately. "You're afraid," she whispered one evening. "You know what she'll do if she suspects you." Henry nodded, his jaw tight. "I've done enough," he admitted. "I can't, not anymore." The first cracks in Madeline's empire began to appear. Slaves whispered of her methods, of men who vanished, of nights filled with fear. Jonathan Reeves gathered what fragments he could, connecting disappearances, inconsistencies in sales, and behavioral patterns among the enslaved men. He knew that confronting Madeline directly would be dangerous, perhaps fatal, but he also realized that inaction would allow her atrocities to continue. On August 3rd, Reeves finally found a way into Madeline's private study. Hidden behind false panels in the library, he discovered a small chest containing the ledger, handwritten, meticulously coded, filled with measurements, observations, and records of men who had disappeared. The evidence was undeniable, but as he examined the ledger, footsteps approached. Madeline had returned unexpectedly. Reeves barely had time to hide the documents before she entered the study, her presence commanding. "Jonathan," she said, her voice silk over steel, "curiosity can be dangerous. Be careful where you look." Reeves held his composure, though his heart pounded. "Madeline, this isn't curiosity anymore. I know what you've done." Madeline's eyes glinted. "Do you? You see only fragments. You do not understand the purpose. Every action, every record, every decision, it was all to expose a truth, to dismantle hypocrisy." Reeves shook his head. "This isn't exposure. This is murder." Madeline smiled, cold and unyielding. "Sometimes to reveal truth, one must act outside the bounds of ordinary morality. You think yourself virtuous because you question, but I have acted. I have made sacrifices, and the system I fight, it would have destroyed them all anyway." The confrontation ended without violence that night, but the stakes had shifted. Madeline now knew that Reeves was close, that her secrets were no longer secure. She intensified her vigilance, increasing inspections, hiding the ledger in more complex locations, and relying on fear to maintain obedience. Reeves, meanwhile, began discreetly recruiting allies, both among the enslaved and sympathetic outsiders, plotting a way to secure the evidence without alerting Madeline. Each day became a dangerous game of observation, deception, and careful maneuvering. The summer stretched into fall. The tension on Caro Plantation became unbearable, a silent pressure that threatened to erupt at any moment. The slaves moved with nervous precision. Lydia carried her growing fear as a constant weight. Henry grappled with his guilt and fear of exposure, and Madeline, brilliant and terrifying, maintained her empire of shadows. The stage was set for a confrontation that could end in revelation or destruction. The question was no longer whether Madeline's secret would be exposed, but who would survive the fallout when it finally came to light. By late October 1841, Caro Plantation had transformed from a place of quiet dread into a tension-choked pressure cooker. The slaves moved like shadows, ever alert to the slightest sign of Madeline's wrath. Jonathan Reeves had grown bold, using the confusion of harvest season to conceal his movements and expand his investigation. Each day brought him closer to the ledger, and each day brought the fear that he might be discovered. Henry, now withdrawn and haunted, quietly aided Jonathan, slipping notes, pointing out hidden caches, and revealing the routes Madeline used to move men and materials around the plantation. Lydia remained cautious but resolute, her courage strengthened by months of silent observation and secret guidance. The three of them formed an invisible network of resistance beneath the oppressive surface of the plantation. The turning point came on a moonless night in early November. Madeline, confident in her control, had retired to her quarters after a long evening inspection. She believed her empire of fear was intact, her secrets well protected, and her ledger securely hidden behind a false panel in the library. She could not have known that Jonathan had spent weeks memorizing the floor plan, observing her routines, and identifying weaknesses in her defenses. Jonathan and Henry moved silently through the shadow. Using a small set of tools Henry had smuggled, they gained access to the library and opened the false panel. There it was, the ledger, meticulously written, each page a record of horror disguised as genealogy and observation. Jonathan's hands shook as he turned the pages, absorbing the truth of Madeline's crimes. "Everything," he whispered. "All of it." Henry nodded. "We need to leave before she notices. Then we take this to someone who can act." But fate, as it often does, had a cruel sense of timing. A floorboard creaked. Madeline's sharp instinct had not failed her. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes blazing with fury and calculation. "You," she said, voice calm but lethal. "I knew curiosity would betray you eventually." Jonathan froze. Henry stepped forward, placing himself slightly between her and the ledger. "Madeline," he said, voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "This ends tonight. The ledger is evidence of atrocities. You can't." Madeline laughed softly, a sound devoid of warmth. "Atrocity? No, Henry. I am a recorder of truth, a protector of history. The men I selected, the ledger I created. It is justice, the only justice that could ever reach them." Jonathan realized the futility of argument. "These men are dead because of you, innocent men. You've crossed a line beyond any moral defense." For a long moment, there was silence, the kind that carries the weight of inevitability. Then, with a suddenness that startled both men, Madeline lunged. She was fast, precise, her years of power and control giving her an edge in the confined space of the library. Henry barely managed to block her. Books tumbled, the ledger nearly falling to the floor. Jonathan seized the moment. "Lydia," he whispered urgent. From her hiding place she burst into the room, carrying a lantern and a small revolver. Henry had managed to hide. The light illuminated Madeline's face, her fury and shock clearly visible. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Madeline, realizing she was outnumbered, backed away, her eyes darting for escape. Jonathan advanced carefully, the ledger clutched tightly to his chest. "It's over," he said. "Your time is over." Madeline's shoulders sagged, a faint trace of exhaustion crossing her features. For the first time in years, she seemed human, vulnerable. "You think you've won," she said softly, voice trembling, "but the truth cannot be destroyed." Jonathan nodded. "Then we'll make sure it's heard. Every atrocity, every name, every deed. You won't decide who survives anymore." The next days were a blur of careful planning. The ledger was transported secretly to the nearest town, and Jonathan contacted authorities and sympathetic abolitionists in Georgia and beyond. The story, corroborated by Henry and Lydia, eventually reached newspapers in Savannah and Charleston. The shockwaves were immediate. Families previously considered untouchable faced scrutiny. Legal investigations began, though many were stymied by the passage of time and the destruction of evidence. Madeline was arrested, but her trial was complicated. Her meticulous methods, her decades of planning, and the systemic failure of Southern justice presented challenges. In court, she argued that her actions had been necessary to expose the corruption and hypocrisy of the elite, that her victims were symbols not targets, but for the public, for the families who had lost men, and for Jonathan Reeves. The moral calculus was simple. Murder could never be justified, no matter the cause. The trial lasted months. Witnesses were brought from the plantation, including surviving slaves, whose testimonies revealed the true horror of Caro Plantation. Henry testified, providing the ledger and explaining Madeline's methods. Lydia's voice, firm and unwavering, recounted the nights of terror and manipulation. In the end, Madeleine Caro was convicted of multiple counts of murder and abuse. She was sentenced to life in prison, her wealth confiscated, her empire dismantled. The ledger, though, remained her legacy, a dark, undeniable testament to both her brilliance and her monstrosity. For Jonathan, Henry, and Lydia, the aftermath was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the cost had been immense. The men who had perished at Caro Plantation could not be brought back, and the wounds inflicted on the survivors could not be erased. Yet, in exposing the truth, they had prevented further atrocities. The ledger, carefully preserved, became a historical record, a warning of the extremes to which obsession and twisted morality can lead. In the years that followed, Caro Plantation fell into ruin. Nature reclaimed the land, erasing most physical traces of Madeleine's reign, but the story lived on, first in court records, then in the ledger itself, and finally in the writings of historians who pieced together the full scope of what had occurred. The moral of Caro Plantation is stark. Unchecked power, even when wielded under the guise of justice, can become indistinguishable from the very evil it seeks to destroy. Madeleine Caro believed herself a protector of truth, a crusader against hypocrisy, but in her pursuit she became the architect of terror. And yet, through courage, persistence, and the willingness to confront the uncomfortable, Jonathan Reeves, Henry, and Lydia ensured that history remembered the victims, preserved the evidence, and delivered at least a measure of justice. Decades after the trial, the ruins of Caro Plantation remained a haunting reminder of the horrors that had occurred there. By the 1870s, most of the land had been sold to new owners who cleared the fields and rebuilt portions for farming or residence. Yet, locals spoke in hushed tones about the shadows that seemed to linger near the old main house. Tales of Madeleine Caro's cruelty, whispered among freed slaves and their descendants, became part of the folklore of the region. The ledger, preserved carefully by Jonathan Reeves and later entrusted to sympathetic historians, became a foundational document for those studying the hidden realities of antebellum Georgia. Researchers pored over its pages for decades, gradually uncovering the systematic abuse, exploitation and murder that Madeleine had orchestrated. Each discovery confirmed what oral histories had long suggested, that behind the facade of a genteel plantation lady lay a calculated and ruthless architect of suffering. By the early 20th century, the ledger had been digitized and archived in multiple locations, ensuring that Madeleine's actions could not be erased by time. Scholars debated the ethical implications of her method. Some argued that her campaign, as monstrous as it was, had exposed the hypocrisy and moral rot of Georgia's elite in a way no other record could. Others contended that her killings could never be justified, no matter the intended outcome, and that she had become the very evil she claimed to oppose. Among descendants of Caro Plantation's survivors, Madeleine became a figure of both horror and reluctant fascination. Stories of her manipulation, her intimate abuse of enslaved men, and the deadly precision of her records served as cautionary tales. Some families preserved the oral history as a testament to resilience. Others avoided the subject entirely, unwilling to revisit the trauma. In the academic world, Caro Plantation became a case study in the dangers of moral absolutism and the corruption of power. University courses on American slavery, ethics, and history frequently cited the ledger, the testimonies and the trial. Scholars explored questions Madeleine had unknowingly posed. Can extreme injustice ever be opposed through extreme measures? Does the end justify the means? And what responsibility do those who survive have to preserve or reveal truth when it conflicts with the law or social order? By the mid-20th century, the site of Caro Plantation had been partially developed. A small historical marker acknowledged its existence, but it made no mention of the ledger, the murders or the abuse. The landscape had changed, the fields reclaimed by asphalt and buildings, but the memory of Madeleine's crimes persisted in historical archives and the writings of committed researchers. The story of Caro Plantation forced a broader reckoning with the legacy of slavery and power. It revealed that the structures of oppression were often supported, not only by law, but by the silent complicity of those who looked away. It demonstrated that the consequences of unchecked authority could ripple across decades, affecting individuals and families long after the original act. For Jonathan Reeves and Henry, the aftermath of exposing Madeleine's crimes left a lasting mark. Jonathan documented the ledger extensively, donating copies to institutions across the South and North. Henry, increasingly withdrawn after the trial, lived out his life quietly, haunted by the knowledge of what he had enabled and the lives that had been lost. Lydia moved north, seeking refuge and building a modest life,
while remaining dedicated to the cause of justice and education. In 1959, a century and a half after the first abuses, the ledger was rediscovered in a university archive by a graduate student. The meticulous records, the coded notations and the sketches offered new insight into Madeleine Caro's operation. The student's dissertation sparked debate, but little public outrage. The world had changed, and the power structures Madeleine had fought against were long gone. Yet for historians, the ledger was a chilling reminder of what had been hidden in plain sight. Ultimately, the Caro Plantation story raises timeless questions. It challenges the notion that moral intentions alone can justify destructive action. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can hide behind a veneer of purpose, and that systems of power often survive by silencing those who might expose them. Madeleine Caro's legacy is not one of victory, nor one of total defeat. It is a warning. Her story compels us to examine how we pursue justice, the methods we deem acceptable, and the human cost of our ambitions. The physical traces of Caro Plantation may have vanished, but the ledger, and the memories it contains, endure. Beneath modern streets and buildings lie the shadows of lives manipulated, exploited, and destroyed. The echoes of Madeleine Caro's deeds remind us that history is not only a record of what happened, but a reflection of the moral choices made, the consequences left behind, and the lessons we fail or choose to learn. Madeleine Caro's tale is a stark illustration of the paradox of justice and obsession. The more zealously she pursued her vision of truth, the more she became the very evil she sought to combat. In the end, history did not reward her patience, her planning, or her cruelty. It simply preserved her story as a haunting artifact, a cautionary tale for generations who would attempt to wield power in the name of righteousness.
By the late 19th century, Moss Creek had become little more than a memory, its fields returning to forest and its main house succumbing to decay. Locals who remembered the Creswell name whispered rumors, but few dared to investigate. The horrors that had taken place, murder, manipulation, and the exploitation of enslaved men, had been buried beneath layers of time and silence. Nature itself seemed to reclaim the land, as if erasing the evidence of what had occurred. Yet the impact of Eleanor's actions lingered in ways that history could not easily quantify. Families whose lineage had been tainted by forced unions or hidden affairs carried the legacy in their DNA, even if they remained unaware. Survivors like Ruth lived the rest of their lives with a knowledge they could never share, carrying secrets too dangerous to reveal even in freedom. For them, the psychological weight of Moss Creek was as binding as the chains that had once confined their bodies. The Civil War had obliterated the social and economic structures that had enabled Moss Creek to exist. Plantations were burned, records lost, and the rigid racial hierarchy fractured. Eleanor's carefully orchestrated plan to reveal the hypocrisy of Georgia's elite had been interrupted, yet in the aftermath, the truth lingered, waiting for a chance to be uncovered. In some ways, the war had inadvertently completed her mission. The power of the men she had targeted was broken, even if her evidence remained hidden. The discovery of the graves decades later in 1902 reopened old wounds. Archaeologists and local historians marveled at the meticulousness of Eleanor's work, her careful measurements, sketches, and coded ledgers. The physical evidence matched the oral histories, confirming that Moss Creek had been far more than a typical plantation. Yet the world had moved on. The families she had sought to expose were no longer in positions of influence, and society had shifted in ways that made her revelations largely symbolic rather than catastrophic. By the mid-20th century, scholars began to re-examine Moss Creek in earnest. The rediscovery of Eleanor's iron box and the subsequent decoding of her ledgers provided a chilling glimpse into the intersection of obsession, power, and her work revealed not only the hypocrisy of Southern elites, but also the terrifying potential of a single individual to manipulate and destroy lives under the guise of justice. Historians debated endlessly whether she had been a revolutionary fighting an unjust system, or a monster who had allowed her sense of purpose to justify murder. The surviving narratives of former slaves offered further nuance. Ruth, who lived into the late 1880s, never spoke publicly of what she had seen or heard. Others remembered Eleanor as both terrifying and brilliant, a woman whose intelligence and strategic mind were unmatched, but whose methods were morally corrupt. These testimonies complicated the historical record, presenting a figure who defied simple categorization. She was both victim and perpetrator, revolutionary and murderer, a product of a world that allowed her cruelty to flourish. Moss Creek's story also served as a mirror for the nation. It reflected the extremes to which people might go when systems of power are unchecked and injustice is normalized. Eleanor's obsession with exposing hypocrisy became a warning about the corruption inherent in believing the end justifies the means. Her careful documentation, meant to serve as a tool for justice, became a posthumous lesson in the dangers of obsession, revealing the fine line between righteous indignation and moral corruption. By the 21st century, Moss Creek had been fully transformed. Shopping centers and residential developments covered the land, and historical markers noted only that a plantation had existed there. Few visitors knew that beneath the asphalt lay the remains of men who had been murdered in the name of a twisted sense of justice. The iron box and its ledgers were preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, accessible only to those with the credentials and determination to uncover them. Even with access, the emotional weight of the contents was undeniable. Modern researchers have continued to debate the morality of Eleanor's actions. Could the system she sought to destroy ever have been dismantled without her extreme measures, or did her methods only perpetuate cycles of violence and dehumanization? The answers remain subjective, shaped by the perspectives of historians, ethicists and the descendants of those affected. Moss Creek challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, that systems of oppression can breed extraordinary cruelty, that intelligence and strategy are not inherently moral, and that the consequences of actions, no matter how well-intentioned, can reverberate for generations. In the end, Moss Creek remains a story of shadows of ambition, obsession, and the costs of seeking justice through violence. It is a cautionary tale, a historical puzzle, and a moral test. Eleanor's vision of exposing hypocrisy never fully materialized, yet her meticulous records ensured that her deeds would not be forgotten. The land has changed, the people have passed, but the story endures, waiting for each generation to confront its questions anew. How far is too far in the pursuit of justice? Can evil ever be fought without becoming complicit in its own corruption? And what responsibility do we bear when the evidence of past horrors finally comes to light? Moss Creek, beneath the surface of modern Georgia, holds its answers silently. The graves, the iron box and the coded ledgers are reminders of a world that once existed and a woman whose intelligence and cruelty left an indelible mark. History remembers her not for the lives she destroyed but for the truth she preserved. A truth that challenges every reader to wrestle with the complexity of justice, morality and human ambition. Even decades after the Civil War and the collapse of Moss Creek, the psychological and historical legacy of Eleanor Creswell lingered. Scholars, students and curious researchers pored over the iron box's contents, trying to piece together a narrative that had been meticulously recorded, but deliberately obscured. The coded ledgers, once indecipherable, were now fully understood, revealing the full scope of her obsession. 17 families, countless measurements, sketches and the chilling list of men preserved as evidence. Modern historians marveled at the depth of Eleanor's record keep. Every detail had been catalogued: eye color, hair texture, bone structure, familial connections. She had approached her grim work as a scientist would, collecting data, verifying lineage and creating a meticulous archive of genetic truth. But the ethical line she crossed, murdering human beings to preserve evidence, overshadowed her intellect. Her archive was brilliant and horrifying, a testament to human ingenuity twisted by obsession. The survivors of Moss Creek, like Ruth, remained silent until their death. Their first-hand accounts were fragmentary, remembered as fleeting glimpses of terror and cruelty, of a place where normal rules did not apply and the master's daughter became both executioner and archivist. Scholars pieced together these narratives, juxtaposing them with the hard evidence in the iron box, creating a picture of a plantation unlike any other, a place where the veneer of southern gentility masked a calculated campaign of surveillance, control and murder. Moss Creek's story became a symbol in academic discussions of moral philosophy, historical justice, and the ethics of activism. Was Eleanor revolutionary, acting in service of a higher moral purpose, or was she simply a murderer, whose cleverness and cruelty were disguised as a crusade against hypocrisy? Debates raged. Some argued that her actions were a logical if extreme response to a system that allowed unchecked sexual exploitation and enslavement. Others contended that the premeditated killing of innocents, even in pursuit of justice, transformed her into the very kind of monster she claimed to oppose. The land itself continued to erase the visible signs of Moss Creek. Suburban developments, schools and shopping centers now occupied the fields and ruins of the Creswell estate. Tourists and residents passed over the asphalt,
unaware of the graves beneath, of the iron box that survived wars, floods, and decades of neglect. History had physically buried the plantation, but not its moral and psychological consequences. The legacy of Moss Creek persisted in stories, archives, and in the questions it forced later generations to ask. One lesson of Moss Creek is the danger of righteousness untempered by compassion. Eleanor's brilliance was undeniable, but her capacity for cruelty revealed how easily a sense of purpose can corrupt. She meticulously catalogued truth, yet committed acts that no justice system could condone. Her work prompts reflection on the balance between action and morality, on how far one can go in the pursuit of justice, before the pursuit itself becomes the crime. Even today, when historians and ethicists study Moss Creek, they confront uncomfortable questions. Could anyone in her position have acted differently in 1850s Georgia? Was there any path to justice available to her that did not involve murder, or was the system so entrenched in cruelty and denial that only extreme action could pierce its veil? Moss Creek becomes a mirror reflecting society's failures, the limits of law, the inequities of race and power, and the moral dilemmas that arise when confronting entrenched injustice. Moss Creek also forces modern observers to grapple with the notion of time and consequence. Eleanor's revelations, had they been released during her lifetime, could have caused monumental upheaval in Georgia's elite society, but history's timing rendered them ineffective, leaving only the moral question: when the evidence arrives too late, does truth retain its power, or does it exist only as a haunting reminder of what could have been? The iron box, finally decoded, offers more than just historical fact. It offers a moral reckoning. It reminds us that systems of oppression create not only victims, but also perpetrators in the shadows of perceived justice. Eleanor Creswell, brilliant, cruel, and determined, embodied the paradox of fighting evil with methods that became evil themselves. Moss Creek's hidden history forces a confrontation with our assumptions about justice, morality, and the human capacity for both ingenuity and atrocity. The plantation may have vanished physically, but its lessons endure. Moss Creek stands as a warning. When society legitimizes cruelty, some may respond with ingenuity and resolve, but that response may be indistinguishable from the evil it seeks to oppose. Eleanor's story challenges readers to consider where the line lies between justice and vengeance, between right and wrong, and how history judges those who act outside its laws to enforce their own moral codes. In the end, Moss Creek is not just a story of one woman's obsession. It is a meditation on power, morality, and the consequences of acting without accountability. Eleanor Creswell remains a figure who defies easy classification, a historian of injustice, an avenger, a murderer, and a woman whose vision for truth came at an unimaginable cost. The land has changed, the society has evolved, and the world has moved on. But the ethical questions raised by Moss Creek remain timeless, demanding that each generation confront them anew.
By the mid-20th century, Moss Creek had been reduced to memory and obscurity, its horrors largely forgotten by the public. Yet the story of Eleanor Creswell continued to ripple quietly through academic circles and local folklore. Historians debated the significance of her archive, the morality of her actions, and the implications for understanding Southern society. What emerged was a consensus that Moss Creek was not merely a plantation, but a lens through which the contradictions and hypocrisies of 19th century Georgia could be examined. Eleanor's meticulous documentation offered irrefutable evidence that the white families she targeted had constructed their wealth and power atop generations of sexual exploitation and forced labor. Her work revealed patterns of abuse and hypocrisy that were otherwise invisible in public records, portraits, and genealogies. Yet the very act of exposing these truths came at the ultimate cost, the deliberate taking of human life. While her victims had been complicit only in the fact of their existence, she had chosen them as instruments for a purpose that history would not immediately recognize. Modern readers and scholars often find themselves grappling with a dissonance. Eleanor's intellect and foresight, her devotion to uncovering truth, are undeniable, but her methods, calculated murder, deception, and intimidation, blur the line between justice and atrocity. Moss Creek became a stark reminder that moral clarity can become dangerously distorted when guided by vengeance rather than law or compassion. The descendants of Moss Creek's enslaved population remembered only fragments, whispered warnings, fearful glances, and the tales passed down through generations. Ruth, the woman who had witnessed the initial killings and survived, became a keeper of memory. She refused to speak publicly of what she had seen, understanding that the truth was not just dangerous, it was almost unimaginable. By her death in 1889, she had carried the burden alone, a silent witness to the extremes of human cunning and cruelty. Eleanor's plan to release her archive and expose the elite of Georgia never came to fruition. The Civil War intervened, consuming the South and disrupting the society she sought to challenge. The chaos of war, coupled with her death from pneumonia in 1863, meant that the evidence she had labored over for decades remained hidden, encoded in the iron box beneath her plantation's floorboards. Her son, Henry Lell, vanished amid the upheaval, leaving no one to continue the mission. When the artifacts were finally rediscovered in 1902, the world had changed. Slavery was abolished. The elite families she sought to unmask were either extinct or diminished, and the moral context of her crimes had shifted. The revelations, though historically significant, lacked the immediate impact she had intended. The narrative of Moss Creek became an academic curiosity, a footnote in the study of antebellum Georgia, rather than the explosive revelation that could have toppled powerful households. Yet Moss Creek continues to resonate because of the questions it poses. What is the value of truth when it arrives too late? Can acts of violence ever be justified in service of a higher moral purpose? How do we reckon with the complexity of historical actors who embody both brilliance and brutality? Eleanor Creswell's story refuses simple answers. She was a chronicler of injustice, a meticulous planner and a ruthless executor. Her vision of justice was clear in her mind, but the methods she employed transformed her into the very type of figure she despised. In the end, Moss Creek's legacy is both cautionary and compelling. It serves as a warning of how moral certainty, when untethered from empathy and human consequence, can produce unimaginable horror. At the same time, it stands as a testament to the enduring human desire to document truth and confront lies, even when the cost is extraordinary. Eleanor's iron box, now safely preserved in archives, remains a silent witness to a story of ambition, cruelty, and the limits of justice. The land itself bears no memory of the horrors it once hosted. Shopping centers, asphalt and suburban sprawl cover the fields and rocky grounds where lives were lost and histories manipulated. The graves are unmarked, the victims unnamed, their stories surviving only in the coded pages of a long-forgotten archive. And yet for those who study Moss Creek, the lessons remain profound. History is shaped not only by events that unfold publicly, but also by secrets, silences, and acts carried out in the shadows. Moss Creek forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, power, and morality. Eleanor Creswell's actions challenge our assumptions about justice, vengeance, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Her story illustrates how the pursuit of a moral cause, no matter how noble in conception, can spiral into cruelty and obsession when guided by personal obsession rather than societal accountability. In reflecting on Moss Creek, we are reminded that history is rarely simple. It is messy, morally ambiguous, and often shaped by forces beyond an individual's control. Eleanor Creswell is neither wholly villain nor wholly hero. She exists in the gray space where morality, intellect, and obsession intersect. Her life and the story of Moss Creek stand as enduring reminders of the complexity of human action, the weight of historical evidence, and the ethical dilemmas that continue to challenge us today. Though Eleanor Creswell's physical legacy, the plantation, the barn, the iron box, was eventually unearthed, the moral legacy she left behind remains far more complicated. Her carefully encoded ledgers revealed truths that had been invisible to public scrutiny for generations. Yet those truths arrived too late to punish the guilty or protect the innocent. The men she murdered, the lives she manipulated, and the system she sought to expose existed in a historical context that no longer recognized the force of her revelations. Historians who study Moss Creek continue to grapple with the paradox of Eleanor's action. On one hand, she documented the stark hypocrisy of the Southern elite with remarkable precision. The evidence she gathered, genealogical charts, physical measurements, and coded notes, demonstrates a meticulous mind and a relentless pursuit of truth. On the other hand, her methods, murder, intimidation, and the manipulation of others, reveal how the desire for justice can become corrupted by obsession and personal vengeance. In many ways, Moss Creek stands as a testament to the dangers of moral absolutism. Eleanor believed that the ends justified the means, that exposing the truth of Georgia's elite required extreme measures, yet in executing her plan, she became the very embodiment of the cruelty and disregard for human life that she condemned. The very system she sought to challenge, the oppressive racial hierarchies and moral hypocrisy of the South,
was replicated in her actions, albeit in reverse. She wielded power over life and death, choosing who would live and who would die based on her own judgment of historical necessity. Ruth, the enslaved woman who witnessed much of Moss Creek's horror, offers another layer of moral reflection. Her silence throughout her life illustrates the burdens borne by those who witness atrocities and the limits of individual agency under systems of oppression. Even in freedom, Ruth understood that some truths were too dangerous to share, that the knowledge of what had occurred at Moss Creek could unleash consequences beyond her control. Her life embodies the quiet moral courage of survival, an antithesis to Eleanor's active but violent pursuit of justice. The story of Moss Creek also raises enduring questions about historical evidence and the meaning of truth. Eleanor's archive was irrefutable, yet it failed to achieve its intended effect. By the time it was decoded in the mid-20th century, the power structures she sought to expose had already collapsed or transformed. The racial and social hierarchies she documented no longer held the same sway, leaving the revelations historically significant but socially in. This disconnect forces reflection on the nature of historical impact. Truth alone does not guarantee change, and documentation without timely action may ultimately serve only as a record of what could have been. Moss Creek's ultimate lesson is as much about human nature as it is about history. Eleanor Creswell demonstrates the tension between intellect and morality, between knowledge and action, and between justice and vengeance. Her story challenges us to consider the consequences of allowing personal conviction to override ethical boundaries. It asks whether it is possible to pursue justice without perpetuating the very harms one seeks to redress, and whether historical evidence retains meaning when it arrives too late to influence outcome. Today, Moss Creek exists only in fragments, a historical marker in a parking lot, the digitized ledgers housed in archives, and the stories passed down through scholarly research. Its victims remain largely anonymous, their graves unmarked, yet the echoes of their lives and deaths resonate through time. The Plantation, once a site of meticulous cruelty and documentation, now stands as a silent testament to the limits of human ambition and the enduring complexity of moral judgment. As we study Eleanor's life, we are confronted with uncomfortable questions. Can acts of violence ever be justified in pursuit of a perceived greater good? Does meticulous documentation of injustice absolve one from moral responsibility for the methods used to reveal it? How should history remember those whose intentions may have been noble but whose actions inflicted irreversible harm? Moss Creek offers no easy answers, only the stark reminder that history, morality, and justice are entwined in ways that defy simple resolution. The story of Moss Creek is, above all, a mirror. It reflects the human capacity for both insight and atrocity, for meticulous thought and reckless action. It invites us to examine the structures of power, the choices we make in pursuit of justice, and the consequences that follow when ambition overrides compassion. Eleanor Creswell's archive, once intended to be an instrument of reckoning, now serves as a historical artifact of complexity, a record of both moral courage and moral corruption. In the end, Moss Creek challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the pursuit of justice, when divorced from ethical constraint, can become indistinguishable from the very evil it seeks to eradicate. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all, that in the shadows of history, in the spaces between truth and action, lies the complicated and often tragic human struggle to reconcile justice with morality.